The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, ladies, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. We're here today to discuss the President's FY17 budget request for the Middle East and North Africa region. I fully support the request to honor the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, with our closest ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, and helping to ensure that she has what she needs to defend herself and her citizens. In the aftermath of the weak and dangerous Iran nuclear deal and the corresponding race to arms by many of the nations in the region who feel threatened by a newly empowered Iran, Israel is facing a new dangerous environment, so it is critical that we ensure that Israel's qualitative military edge is intact and vigorously enforced as our policy stipulates and as our laws state. So I strongly urge the administration to conclude the negotiations on a new, robust MOU with Israel in an expeditious manner and in a way that reflects the new reality that the Jewish state faces in the region. I'm also pleased that the administration is following through with the additional support for Jordan as agreed upon in last year's MOU, with $1 billion to help the kingdom cope with the strain on its resources from the Syrian humanitarian crisis and the influx of refugees, as well as help provide Jordan with the tools that it needs to continue to fight on the front lines against ISIS. However, this request for Jordan highlights one of the most noteworthy trends of the current request, which is the administration's continued shift to move a significant amount of assistance from the regular foreign affairs budget to the Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO accounts. Nearly half of this year's budget request is OCO funds, $3.5 billion of the $7.1 billion for the Middle East and North Africa in non-humanitarian bilateral aid. That's over 100% more than last year's request, with almost all of the $1 billion for Jordan coming in OCO. This is a troubling trend that the administration needs to explain in greater detail, as we are seeing funds that should be in the base budget that are being shifted into the OCO fund. Tunisia is strategically important, and this is where the democratic transition has been referred to by the administration as a model for other states in the Arab world. However, when compared to Egypt, Jordan, or even Lebanon, our aid package to Tunisia does not really indicate that the administration views its future as a high priority. The people and government of Tunisia need us now more than ever. While this year's request may represent an increase, foreign military financing assistance for Tunisia's security accounts for $45 million, while slightly more than that is being provided for democracy and governance and economic assistance. Tunisia is facing some trying times at the moment, and we want to support it and ensure that it remains on the transition toward democracy, yet the administration does not appear to be making a successful transition a priority in this request. While Lebanon may be facing significant problems as a result of the Syrian conflict, it has been mired in a political crisis for nearly 2 years and has no elected leader, and concerns remain, over Hezbollah and Iran's increasing influence in Lebanon. This raises questions over how our assistance to Lebanon is being used to advance our interests. The same can be said over continued assistance requests for Libya or Yemen, two other countries in dire political straits. When it comes to strategic interests in the region, Egypt remains near the top. Egypt's security and stability are key U.S. national security interests, which is why we continue to provide Cairo with the foreign military assistance, financing assistance it needs, and we will continue to work with Egypt to tackle the terrorist threats in the Sinai. Yet in Egypt, we are facing a significant pipeline issue where between $500 to $700 million in previous year's funds have not been spent nor obligated. Yet the administration continues to request $150 million in ESF for Egypt without presenting a concrete plan on how it will spend these unobligated funds and without having the flexibility to operate in Egypt that we once had. When we discuss our assistance as effectively and efficiently as possible, we have to talk about our response to the Syrian humanitarian crisis. The United States has been the single largest donor in response to the Syrian humanitarian crisis by providing over $5 billion, and will continue to do what we can, but our policies to get at the root cause of the problem have failed, and Assad still remains in power. While most of this assistance being funneled through the UN, it raises question about whether or not we are maximizing our assistance in this humanitarian response. But when talking about using our assistance effectively in furtherance of our interests, perhaps the most egregious failure of this budget request is the continued request by the administration for hundreds of millions in assistance for the West Bank and Gaza. The Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen have continued to incite violence against Israel, have continued to support terrorism, have continued to fund the salaries of terrorists in Israeli prisons, as well as their family members. And the Palestinians continue to seek to delegitimize the Jewish state at the United Nations and are moving forward with plans to undermine the peace process by seeking unilateral statehood. The administration may argue that it has sought less for the Palestinian Authority in this year's budget request, but we should have cut off all assistance to the PA for violating several provisions of U.S. law. So I welcome our distinguished guest. I look forward to hearing from the administration about the justifications for his budget request and how these line up with the administration's objectives for the coming year in the Middle East and North Africa. And with that, I'm so pleased to yield to the ranking member, my good friend, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I hope you feel better. And thank you, Assistant Administrator Alexander and Assistant Secretary Patterson, for being here today. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to the subcommittee. We look forward to a positive discussion about the region. I want to take a moment again to thank the hardworking USAID and State Department employees and Foreign Service officers who work in dangerous and difficult places to help those in need and promote American values around the world. Their work too often goes unnoticed and underappreciated. I just want to take a moment today to highlight what they do and to thank them for it. It's no doubt that some of our greatest foreign policy challenges are in the Middle East and North Africa. New threats have emerged that endanger the security of the United States, our regional interests, and our regional partners. This year's State Department budget request for the region is $7.3 billion, a 9% increase from what we spent in 2015. Of the $6.1 billion requested in global humanitarian aid, $2 billion is to address the humanitarian crisis in Syria. For over 5 years, the region has been struggling to deal with the effects of the war in Syria. The devastating humanitarian crisis will certainly have implications, not just this coming year, but for years to come and for decades to come. I've repeatedly expressed my deep frustration over the international response to the humanitarian crisis in Syria, but I'd like to applaud the administration for the contribution that it's made to address this crisis, the largest from any donor country to date. But as the crisis continues to drag on, we must look for sustainable ways to support those displaced by war. Efforts to shore up host countries like Lebanon and Jordan must focus on increasing capacity of schools and healthcare centers, finding work that will allow refugees to contribute to the communities that are hosting them. I was pleased to see the conclusion last spring of the new MOU with our ally Jordan that will help to strengthen one of our best partners in the fight against ISIS. We all know that the only end to this crisis will come through a political solution. Speaking yesterday, Ambassador Power said, there is, and I quote, an inextricable linkage between the political transition negotiations, which of course urgently have to take place, the deterioration in humanitarian access, and the escalation of violence on the ground, which is having a very negative bearing on the cessation of hostilities, which had reduced violence substantially. There is so much that we have to be engaged in so many levels in Syria. In addition to Syria, the humanitarian situation in Yemen continues to worsen. As political talks stall, The needs of those on the ground are increasing, and the U.S. and other donor countries must be able to respond accordingly. In Tunisia, we look for ways to bolster the country's economy and nascent democracy while stabilizing the security situation. The Tunisian government has thus far responded well to the number of deadly attacks over the past year, and we have seen positive results from our efforts to help Tunisian security forces professionalize in these difficult circumstances. However, it's troubling that the largest contingent of foreign fighters to ISIS are Tunisian, and the entrance of ISIS to Libya will continue to pose a threat to the region, and especially to Tunisia. The security situation in Libya is tenuous. Just last week, U.S. General David Rodriguez, the outgoing commander of AFRICOM, said that the number of ISIS fighters in Libya has doubled in the past year. That's why it's more important than ever that Libya move forward with implementing a unity government. A strong central government backed by Libyan security forces is the only way to keep ISIS at bay. Combating ISIS in North Africa will require strong cooperation across the Maghreb. Morocco and Algeria must play a significant role in intelligence sharing, both with its neighbors as well as with the U.S. and Europe, to track foreign fighters and terror cells. And as we work to combat extremism, we appreciate the cooperation between Egypt and Israel on the Sinai, and Egypt's efforts to control the flow of dangerous materials in and out of Gaza and to destroy Hamas's terror tunnels. But however strong and necessary our security cooperation and coordination is, we must also prioritize human rights. Human rights must always be a part of the conversation, even when difficult. And I'm troubled by continued reports of mass sentencings, restrictions on civil society, and most recently, the potential reopening of the NGO case that saw 43 NGO workers arrested and convicted, including several Americans. We've also deepened our coordination with our GCC partners to confront mutual security threats, including Iranian aggression. These countries must also be committed to countering violent Islamic extremism and speaking out against radicalism and terrorism. We must always be sure that nothing we do in the region threatens Israel's qualitative military edge. Israel remains under constant threat from Palestinian terror attacks, Hamas rockets, Hezbollah advanced weaponry, and ballistic missiles launched from Iran emblazoned with the words, "Israel must be wiped off the earth." I would urge the administration to ramp up its efforts to conclude a new memorandum of understanding that will ensure that Israel has what she needs to defend herself for years to come. And as we continue to work toward the goal of 2 states for 2 peoples, I would hope that the administration will work to prevent any attempts to circumvent the direct negotiation process, which is the only way that peace can be achieved. Our efforts would be better served urging President Abbas to build up state institutions, to reform his economy, to commit to transparency and accountability, and to return to the negotiating table. With respect to Iran, I cannot urge the administration enough to fulfill its promises to crack down on Iran's myriad of bad behavior, including the repeated ballistic missile tests in blatant disregard of international law, its egregious human rights violations, and its continued support for terrorism. The U.S. Navy last week intercepted a shipment of Iranian weapons bound for Yemen, and this continued bellicosity is unacceptable. No agreement precludes this country from sanctioning every person, every entity, and every sector involved in these dangerous activities. The nuclear agreement, as we all know, was meant to apply only to nuclear activities and the nuclear program. International law and U.S. law permits us, and I think requires us, to take strong action to stop and to combat Iran's bad behavior in these other areas. And I would also be remiss if Secretary Patterson, Madam Chairman, you'll just grant me an extra 30 seconds, I'd be remiss if I didn't once again implore the administration to continue working to bring home my constituent, Robert Levinson. Just days before the 9th anniversary of Bob's disappearance last month, I had the honor of joining Bob's wife, Christine, and the Levinson children at a rally in Bob's hometown of Coral Springs in South Florida. No family deserves to go through what the Levinsons are going through, being away from their husband, their father, and grandfather with no answers for 9 years. And I know that Secretary Kerry continues to push for Bob's return, but I would ask that this be the highest priority in every single discussion with the Iranians. There is no substitute for robust American engagement and leadership in this challenging region as a whole, and I look forward to hearing how the President's budget request will help fulfill that goal and protect the security of this country and of our friends and allies in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield.
Thank you for an excellent opening statement, and thank you for your leadership, especially on the Levinson case. They are fortunate to have such a strong leader voicing their concerns. I'd like to recognize members for opening statements, and we will begin with Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your dynamic leadership. Secretary Patterson, you've provided that the top line for the State Department and for the Agency of International Development will have a budget of over $50 billion, with around $35 billion in the base budget and $15 billion in OCO. I have seen firsthand America being successful in the Middle East and around the world to aid our allies for their citizens to have fulfilling lives. The budget number is particularly significant this year because of the threat of Iran, who stands to gain as much or 2 or 3 times this amount in cash windfall due to unfrozen assets as part of the tragic Iranian nuclear deal. We've seen Iranian support in financing of the Houthi rebels in Yemen, funding and support for Hamas and Hezbollah, providing rockets to threaten Israel, funding for terrorists and insurgents in Iraq, and support for Afghani Taliban for their terrorist activities. All of these groups have a goal of killing American military and bringing mass murder to families at home in the United States. The concerns of Congress of the failing Iranian nuclear deal has been bipartisan, and I particularly appreciate today the ranking member, Ted Deutsch, raising issues and concerns. With all the United States can accomplish in the Middle East, with the funding that we're providing, the damage that Iran stands to do in the region with $150 billion of cash windfall is dangerous. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on the committee in ensuring proper oversight of the implementation of the bizarre Iranian nuclear deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Deutsch, for calling this hearing to assess President Obama's fiscal year 2017 budget request for the Middle East and North Africa. And thank you to Ambassador Patterson and Administrator Alexander for being here today. I look forward to hearing from you, and I want to thank you both for your dedication and your service to our country. The fiscal year 2017 request of $7.17 billion for the region is an increase of almost 9% over fiscal year enacted levels, fiscal year 15. The vast security and humanitarian needs in the region certainly justify increased spending levels, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how the United States will make sure this money is used effectively to achieve American strategic priorities. This budget request is an issue of critical importance, especially during this time of great flux and threats to global security. From the civil war in Syria and its subsequent humanitarian and refugee crisis, to the threat of ISIL, Boko Haram, and other extremist groups who seek to undermine stability and security throughout the region, to the many humanitarian perils faced by millions of people in the region, it's more important than ever that U.S. foreign assistance is targeted, responsive, and able to meet our principled goals. As Ambassador Patterson states in her written testimony, the Middle East and North Africa present the most demanding challenges to U.S. foreign policy and national security. Through the work of the State Department and USAID, we must remain engaged and do all that we can to help the nations of this region to be more self-sufficient in terms of providing for its peoples through good governance, democratization, and less susceptible and better able to repel extremist threats. Thank you, and I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Issa of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And for each of our two witnesses, it is an incredibly opportune time for you to be here. I have 2 areas of particular concern that I'll be following up with questions on. Ambassador Alexander, in your case, the education of as many as 800,000 Syrians in Lebanon and countless more internally displaced concerns me, in that USAID and all of our refugee organizations seem to be looking at doing but not accomplishing the ultimate goal. Lebanon is ill-equipped to educate 500 to 800,000 additional students, and even if they were, they have no structural plan to do so. Some of the programs USAID has begun with are interesting, including the radio broadcast as a form of education, but they fall far short of 2 goals. One is education that can be verified for purposes of higher education later. The second is a form of education that clearly allows us to have our imprint of non-radicalization on that education process. And I think both of those fall clearly within, between the two of you, a requirement to make sure there is a strategic plan for all the youth in the region, both those who work much of the day and get limited education, and those who may be able to participate in more conventional. Secondly, Ambassador Patterson, you and I have visited many times. You're always at the center of tough situations. Your time in Egypt causes me to say this today. The multinational force observers has outlived its historic role. That has been made very clear by my own and another congressman's visit to the region into the North Station. They are today simply sitting ducks, hunkered down, highly protected, including massive EOD assets for purposes of a count that has not been miscounted or misunderstood or argued for more than 8 years, even with a minor exception, and more than a decade without any real argument. As you know, Israel today counts on very large forces of Egyptians to help with the fight against ISIS in the Sinai. I urge you to recognize that now is the time to recognize that that force existed, although technically to count number of soldiers and police. It really existed to ensure a peace in the region between two countries. Today, that force must be positioned to assist both Israel and the Egyptians in recognizing where ISIS and Hamas are operating, what they're doing, and providing the eyes necessary to help them do their job better. I'm not calling for a moment for the withdrawal of those troops or those personnel, brave as they are, but I want their purpose to be one of peacekeeping between two allies today in the war against ISIS. And I hope you can take that back to Secretary Kerry on behalf of the committee. And I thank the chairwoman for her indulgence.
Very good items that you bring up. Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just, and thank you all for being here again, once again. I had the honor of traveling with our chair, Mr. Royce, this past week to, we were in Jordan, Iraq, and Tunisia, and it was quite an enlightening and rigorous schedule. Madam Chair, my back is still hurting from the body armor, really. But some takeaways. It's not only the threat of terrorism, which is real in so many of these countries in the Middle East, but they are in terrible economic crisis to the point where, I'll use Iraq as an example. I mean, they don't even, not even able to pay for their own army. But what was, you know, there are a lot of moving parts, but what was very clear to me that, number one, our own security and the security of our allies, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe, other places, will be affected greatly by the stability in the Middle East. And my second takeaway was that, or this may be my third takeaway, is that our leadership is absolutely needed. There's no question about it, not only from a military point of view, but just in terms of economic development, education, other humanitarian assistance. So I very much look forward to what you have to say this morning. And again, thank you for your service.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. Mr. Trott.
I'd like to thank Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch for holding this hearing, and to our esteemed witnesses for testifying and sharing their valuable insight on an unstable but crucial part of the world. Ambassador Patterson, before assuming your current post, you were our ambassador to Egypt and served during a very turbulent time. You had a unique perspective on the Muslim Brotherhood, one that I'm hoping to hear more about from you today. For reasons unclear to me, the State Department still refuses to recognize the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I'm proud to co-sponsor legislation in the House, the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act, and I'm eager to see it on the floor for a vote in front of the full House. In recent years, the cops have suffered terrible attacks and violence. The attacks were clearly well planned and coordinated, not random acts of violence as some have suggested. After listening to their rhetoric, laced with remarks coming from their leadership, it's not surprising that they would take out their anger on Egypt's most vulnerable. To make matters worse, the Muslim Brotherhood's official accounts still espouse and congratulate violence, while implicitly, if not explicitly, trying to encourage violence against the state and religious minorities. I'm disappointed the State Department hosted them for official meetings last year. When I questioned Secretary Kerry about this, he claimed that the State Department somehow didn't know they were part of the Muslim Brotherhood until after the visit, something I find difficult to believe. As a country that promotes religious tolerance and acceptance all over the world, I find it reprehensible that the administration claims to promote these values, yet goes around and invites and holds meetings with the various people that have dedicated themselves to religious intolerance and violence. I look forward to your testimony and explanation as to how much more damage the Muslim Brotherhood needs to cause before we call them terrorists. Thank you. I yield back.
Amen. Thank you very much, Mr. Trott. And we are so happy to welcome back wonderful witnesses who are always accessible to us. And anytime we call them, they say, yes, when do you need us? So thank you, ladies, very much for being so good to our subcommittee. First, we're pleased to welcome back Ambassador Ann Patterson, who is Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Ambassador Patterson has served as the U.S. Ambassador in El Salvador, in Colombia, in Pakistan, and in Egypt. She's been also Assistant Secretary of State for International and Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, and the State Department's Deputy Inspector General. Welcome back, Ambassador Patterson. We also want to welcome back another good friend, Assistant Administrator Paige Alexander of the Bureau of the Middle East at USAID. Previously, Ms. Alexander has served as an Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia, as well as Associate Director of Project Liberty at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She has also served on the board of the Basic Education Coalition and the Project on Middle East Democracy. Thank you so much, ladies, and the floor is yours. We'll start with Ambassador Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting us to appear before you today to discuss the President's fiscal year 2017 budget request. We appreciate the subcommittee's continued support and congratulate its initiatives, most recently for the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act of 2015. The Middle East and North Africa presents the most demanding challenges to U.S. foreign policy and to our national security. As you know, the administration's highest priority continues to be the safety and security of the American people and the American homeland. This is why we are leading the global coalition that will defeat ISIL, are actively engaged in supporting the cessation of hostilities and political negotiations in Syria, and are advancing peace in Yemen and Libya. Each of these conflicts poses its own unique challenges to our national security, with the potential for serious economic repercussions. Continued full implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will ensure Iran's nuclear program remains exclusively peaceful. Nevertheless, we remain deeply concerned about Iran's destabilizing activities. The President's foreign assistance request for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs is $7.3 billion. This includes $3.1 billion to support our enduring commitment to Israel's security, $1.5 billion for bilateral cooperation with Egypt to advance our national and regional security interests, and $1 billion to continue our strategic partnership with Jordan on issues ranging from countering violent extremism to advancing Middle East peace. In the coming year, potential openings in Yemen and Libya further highlight how we must work to support U.S. engagement. We must be poised to further our relationship with the Libyan government of national accord as it works to reunite the country, revive the Libyan economy, and confront ISIL. In Yemen, we must help the Yemenis reestablish governance, reclaim space from AQAP, and counter a growing ISIL threat, as well as revive their badly damaged economy. Our capacity to react quickly in changing environments like these will require your continued support and flexibility. However, we cannot focus on crises alone. There are examples of success in the region, and it's in our long-term interest to invest strategically. In Tunisia, we see a burgeoning democracy in need of our support, and in Morocco, our strong partnership spans from security cooperation to addressing economic challenges. This budget provides resources to support U.S. engagement with both Morocco and Tunisia. As part of our efforts to degrade and defeat ISIL, the U.S. is leading a coalition of 66 states and organizations. The request also includes funding to provide training and equipment to forces fighting ISIL, help stabilize communities liberating from ISIL in Syria and Iraq, strengthens our regional partners, and supports a political solution to the Syrian civil war. For Iraq, the FY17 request includes $510 million, an increase over previous years, largely to provide increased economic assistance to stabilize the Iraqi economy and maintain critical security assistance. In Syria, the request of nearly $239 million will provide support to the moderate Syrian opposition to help achieve a political solution and counter extremist threats, including from ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra. In Jordan, we remain a strong supporter of the government's efforts to maintain security, stability, and prosperity, particularly in light of the crises on Jordan's border. And in Lebanon, we are supporting their efforts to cope with the spillover effects of the crisis in Syria. Our request also represents our firm commitment to working with Israel and other regional partners to counter Iran's destabilizing activities in the region. Let me assure you that Israel's security remains a top priority for the administration. It is critical for both the Israelis and the Palestinians that steps are taken to promote stability, so we are requesting nearly $364 million in foreign assistance to support the Palestinian people with programs to bolster economic development, improve health and education, and enhance security on the ground. In Egypt, we have long enjoyed a strategic relationship which furthers our national interests. Nonetheless, we continue to press the Egyptians about our concerns regarding their human rights record. Madam Chairman, I also want to stress the importance of our regional programs. They not only complement our ongoing bilateral assistance, but they are also a tool for advancing our interests. The Middle East Partnership Initiative furthers U.S. engagement with civil society across the region. It empowers women, fosters entrepreneurship, engages at-risk youth, and develops the capacity of local organizations. I want to thank this subcommittee for your ongoing support as we continue to advance our interests in the Middle East. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, member of the subcommittees. We appreciate the opportunity to be up here to talk about the President's fiscal year 17 budget. The region is faced with complex challenges driven by deep political divides, economic and social forces. It's critical that the U.S. maintain its engagement and interest in this region. Conflict and the resulting humanitarian and refugee crisis have significantly compounded the challenges. These conflicts have cut economic output in Syria by 30%. The influx of refugees has lowered wages in some of the most vulnerable host communities. And most alarming is 13 million children are out of school due to this conflict. It may be useful to think of USAID's response in three critical areas: mitigating the human impact of ongoing conflicts, supporting core U.S. national security objectives, and fostering the inclusive development and reform opportunities as they arise. My statement for the record includes more details of aid's priorities, but I wanted to go through a few here. Syria's development challenges and indicators show a rollback of nearly 4 decades due to the conflict, in addition to the U.S. remaining the world's largest donor of humanitarian assistance for the Syrian conflict. The President's budget will request continued American people's support for the development needs within Syria, as well as critical support for Syria's neighbors. The crisis has placed an enormous strain on the neighbors, many neighboring countries, including our ally Jordan. We continue our 6-decade partnership with Jordan to address the development challenges, including low economic growth, overcrowded schools, and scarce water resources. NBC Nightly News recently did a story about a school principal in Jordan who was trying to talk about the overcrowding in her school, and the Syrian parents continued to come and ask that their children be allowed in. She offered that they could come if they just brought a chair. We work with this principal and thousands of other educators like her to make sure that we are providing these services. In Lebanon, some estimates say that 1 out of every 3 people is a refugee. The President's request would support the Lebanese communities hosting refugees, helping them provide basic services like education, water infrastructure, and support municipalities and civil societies, as well as job creation and economic growth activities. For Iraq, the President's 2017 request includes an increase of funding to help address the grave economic challenges that they are facing. We will also work with Baghdad and the local governments in support of decentralization efforts. Our support will ease the burden of Iraq's fiscal crisis as it struggles to defeat ISIL and stabilize liberated areas. The U.S. government and the American people have a long-standing relationship with Egypt and the Egyptian people. USAID continues to work in partnership with the Egyptian people, but we remain deeply concerned about the restrictions in space for civil society and the reported investigations and NGOs by the government of Egypt. USAID and the State Department continue to engage with our Egyptian counterparts on this issue. Given the current challenging environment, aid continues to focus its program in areas where we believe we can achieve results. In the West Bank and Gaza, U.S. assistance to the Palestinian people is a key part of the U.S. commitment to a negotiated two-state solution. Our assistance contributes to building a more democratic, stable, prosperous, and secure Palestinian society, a goal that is in the interest not only of the Palestinians, but of Israel and the United States as well. For fiscal year 2017, we will promote stability in the West Bank by improving service provision in healthcare, education, water, and roads, while also supporting the private sector and civil society. In Gaza, we will provide needed humanitarian assistance while at the same time addressing pressing needs, particularly in the water sector. As the peace process proceeds in Yemen and the security environment allows, USAID will provide expertise to support negotiation process while supporting civil society and the inclusion of women and youth. In Libya, the 2017 funding will support the government of national accord and deliver targeted assistance to support a stable political transition. Where we are able to in the region, we aim to help our local partners address frustrations brought on the people in the streets 5 years ago. In Morocco, USAID is well positioned to advance the country's critical economic and social reforms. Among those who benefit from our programs were 2 teenage boys in northern Morocco who were planning to head to Syria and stopped in first at a USAID-supported youth organization. A trained youth officer was able to convince them of an alternate path, setting them up instead with jobs at a local construction company. Before I conclude, I'd like to speak about Tunisia, which has been relatively successful in its transition but still needs our support. Tunisia is the only country from the 2011 Arab Awakening that has defined a path towards democracy. The President's 2017 request will provide additional resources to support Tunisia as it consolidates these gains, including expanding economic and governance partnerships between the U.S. and Tunisia. AID's efforts in Tunisia have created nearly 4,000 sustainable private sector jobs last year, and we expect our interventions will result in more than 5,000 additional jobs this year. We face significant challenges in the Middle East and North Africa, but the American people can be proud that through USAID and with the support of Congress, we are helping millions of people in the region. Whether it's the girl at the STEM school in Egypt who has conquered Intel science, or whether it's the teacher and the principal in Jordan who have invited other Syrian children into her classroom, these are some of the concrete examples of our programs. I'm proud of the innovative work that we have been doing to meet the many challenges of the region, and will continue to work better, smarter, and faster to support the people of the Middle East and North Africa on behalf of the American people. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to both of our witnesses. I'd like to once again welcome you both back here and thank you for your continued service on behalf of our country. Assistant Secretary Patterson, I wanted to follow up on a question that I had posed to Secretary Kerry in February. I asked if the administration will veto any resolution at the UN supporting Palestinian statehood. He stated that it was the policy of the administration to oppose any one-sided resolution that would be unfair to Israel, but he didn't give a blanket statement that, yes, the U.S. would veto. So I want to clear this up just a bit more, because last week, the Palestinian Authority, the PA, distributed a draft resolution to a number of members at the UN Security Council similar to the one that the U.S. did in fact veto in 2011. This absence of an American voice saying that we will veto gives wind beneath the wings of the Palestinians to continue this unilateral statehood scheme. So will the administration state unequivocally that we will not introduce, we will not support, that we will block, that we will veto any resolution at the UN Security Council that seeks to impose a two-state solution on Israel or that offers some artificial timeline for negotiations?
Madam Chairman, let me answer this question this way. This administration, there was an article in the newspaper a few days ago that this administration has been the most vigorous in history in pursuing and protecting Israel's interest in the United Nations system, and I can speak to that from personal experience, both at the Security Council and the GA and in the specialized agencies. I can't say without seeing a resolution, and we're familiar with this resolution.
But there is, it's not
There
a
is
hypothetical.
No,
Have you
it's not
seen the
hypothetical.
resolution?
But it has not been introduced into the
But,
Security Council.
but the draft exists.
It draft exists,
Have you seen it?
and I haven't personally seen it, but it's not part of, it hasn't been introduced.
Do you think
into-
that perhaps this lack of clarity to say, we vetoed it before, we're going to veto it again, and here's the draft, and if this draft is going to be worked on, we will veto it. When we don't say that, they're going to continue with their unilateral statehood schemes, wouldn't you?
Madam Chairman, all I can say is I think the administration's record on this is pretty clear, is
I
very
know,
clear.
that's why it's worrisome.
And we have defended
is
Israel
clear.
vigorously. So I can't say without seeing the resolution because like most
Well,
things
it's
in
not
New
a
York-
hypothetical, it exists. But staying with the PA, Madam Ambassador, money is fungible, and any amount of money that, oh, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you. Let me just wait right here. I heard a lot of rumbling here, but I did not look aside. So I will stop here, and let me recognize the chairman of our committee, Mr. Royce, for his questions.
Well, thank you. I thank our chairman emeritus here. And Secretary Patterson, it's good to see you again. Let me, since that issue was the one you were speaking on, and Mr. Deutsch and I have had some discussions about this as well, and you've really led on this issue. What concerns us is twofold. It is not just that for some years now you have a system where basically there's been an inducement to pay human assassins to seek out innocent people and kill them, and then a stipend is given for the time that those individuals serve in custody for their crime. And that stipend is dependent upon the severity of their crime. In other words, the amount per month paid into the fund or going to the family is dependent upon how heinous the crime, how many victims. And in addition, there is, if it's bad enough, you serve enough time, then you're automatically given a position in the Palestinian Authority once you get out. That was the old system. Now, you were before the committee before and were asked about this, and at the time you indicated, well, that is being, what were your words at the time, I think, phased out or something, words to that effect. And that we should, on this, give them more time because they're phasing it out. Let me just share for you and for the committee members here, Mr. Deutsch and others, what we've observed since then. And that is that this process is not only continuing, but rather than the PA make the stipend directly out of the budget, what they have instead done is go to the PLO budget and make a transfer to the PLO for a sum, let's say the original budgeted item for assistance with the Palestinian Authority's prison funding was $8 million. Suddenly it goes up suddenly goes up to 140 million. Well, the difference is the sum taken off of the books of the PA, but it's in the same building. The PA Ministry of Prison Adjudication or whatever is the same ministry as the PLO. As a matter of fact, it is the same minister. I believe you'll find that to be the case. So in fact, they weren't phasing it out. What they were simply doing was transferring the entire sum over to the PLO so that that payment could continue to be made. And I think we should, we should understand that besides the fact that the donor community is paying into the Palestinian Authority, and the end result is to create a system to recruit human beings to carry out attacks and then serve their time and be rewarded with a stipend, not just for the family, but a retirement afterwards and a job in the Palestinian Authority if it is egregious enough. These are real concerns about how we prepare people to put the foundation down for peace. Second, I want the Europeans to know what's going on. And you're going to have the opportunity to dialogue with Europe about this and other problems. As I shared with Dr. Abbas and Mr. Deutsch shared as well when we were there talking with him about the issue of incitement, it is very, very important that the right foundation be laid for preparing future generations of young Palestinians and young Israelis to live in peace. And surely a system which tries to recruit more girls to do killing because you get an additional stipend if you're a girl, or there's a stipend upon a stipend if you are an Israeli and commit an act against another Israeli. This is a very perverse creation, unbelievably perverse. And I'd like your response there. And second, how did you mean that to be taken by us at the time, by the committee, when you said they're phasing this out? Did you know that they were going to simply transfer this to the PLO? And in that sense, they were phasing it off their books, but they weren't phasing it out. They were simply disguising the funding. I wanted to ask you about that.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Royce. No, I didn't know that. What I was basing that on was my own discussions with Palestinian members who said they had been phasing it out for financial and the other reasons that you discussed, and I totally agree with you that this is an egregious practice. But let me also stress, Mr. Chairman, that I think our assistance to the Palestinian Authority does many beneficial things in the security, maintaining security and promoting entrepreneurship and promoting better health standards and infrastructure development, and is absolutely essential for the stability in this part of the world. So we will continue to press them on this issue, which I entirely agree with you is an unacceptable one.
Ambassador, basically the donor community is helping the Palestinian Authority basically pay people to slay other people. So here's my point. I want us to use our considerable leverage to end that practice. And second, I would really like the European community, in our dialogue with them, to fully comprehend what's going on in this process of the inducements of paying people to get them to go out and slay other human beings. Can you do that? Can you
Yes,
assure us that both of those
We will certainly
that
take
will be
that
at the
up with
top
our-
of your agenda, conveying that so that when the European delegations come in, they'll be asking me as well, what are we doing as members of Congress to end this practice?
No, we will certainly talk to our European colleagues. As a point, another point I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman, none of our money goes to this. It's not fungible in that respect. Our money goes essentially to pay PA Authority debts to Israel and to other creditors. So the budget relief, the budget support that you see in the budget goes to creditors and cannot be diverted to these stipends.
Yeah, but the reality is that the donor community is coming together internationally to fund the Palestinian Authority. Our hope had always been that this would be used for a certain type of textbooks to actually teach kids an education instead of how to hate, for a certain kind of broadcasting that would be inclusive, that would maybe be about political tolerance and about, religious tolerance and laying the foundation for peace, and that also, in terms of the prison system, it might be about rehabilitation instead of creating a system where you're encouraging additional people to go out and commit murder in order later in life to get a position of high authority in the Palestinian Authority itself. And so since the donor community is putting money into that pot in order, in one way or the other, to help the Palestinian people, regardless of how we perceive it, we have to use our leverage to cut this out. And now is the time to do it. And now is the time to have this dialogue, because they've just upped the ante, basically, by now paying people an additional stipend if you commit crimes within Israel, within the borders of Israel. I know they don't recognize borders, because I asked Mr. Abbas that very question, and Mr. Deutsch will remind. I asked him, by the way, where is Israel on your map when we were discussing incitement? And he says, where's your map? Show me your map. Here's the point. We, the donor community, are putting the money in. Let's make sure that it goes to the next generation of young Palestinians having an attitude of wanting to have peace, wanting to negotiate with Israelis, and wanting to do something other than wipe them off the map or slay them. And that's my point.
Mr. Chairman, rest assured that this will be a subject of discussion and with the rest of the donor community. We see Europeans and other donors all the time, and rest assured your points will be conveyed with our full concurrence.
Thank you, Secretary Patterson.
Mr. Chairman, you are welcome to come in and crash our subcommittee anytime. Please do so more often.
Well, actually, I'm a member of the committee too. So.
Okay.
But I appreciate your forbearance.
It's so
I
much.
appreciate the
it's
forbearance.
much more fun to say crash. Are you sure you're done? Because you're fired up.
No, I yield back, Madam Chairman.
All right, thank you. And I will just wrap up with, because everything he said, ditto. Let me just ask a question on Morocco. Recently, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon claimed Morocco is occupying the Western Sahara, an unbelievable violation of UN neutrality. The U.S. is tasked with drafting the resolution that will renew the mandate of MINURSO. It is very important that the draft resolution be clean, without any divisive language. Is the administration willing to work with Congress and our ally, Morocco, to strengthen our bilateral relationship while avoiding this mess created by Ban Ki-moon? And where does that draft resolution currently stand?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yes, this was a very, very unfortunate occurrence. The Secretary has been on the phone with the King and with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Mazar, and we've tried to do everything possible and to basically help them restore relations, because again, a very unfortunate incident between the UN and the government of Morocco. Morocco is one of our strongest allies. They're a critical partner in the counterterrorism field. They have made very significant advances in governance and human rights, and we very much value our relationship. The resolution, Madam Chairman, hasn't been drafted. We're discussing that in the administration. We certainly would take your views into account, and I stress that.
What's the timeline for the resolution?
The timeline for the resolution, I think we have a few more weeks. Thank you, but we'll be
Please keep us
consulting with
abreast.
the committee.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Deutsch, for your patience, and take as much time as you would like.
Thanks very much, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Patterson, there were a lot of stories in the media over the past couple of weeks that Congress was not in session about the administration's plans with respect to Iran stories about giving Iran direct access to dollars or to the U.S. financial system as part of sanctions relief, the rules about indirect use of dollars from transactions with Iran as long as they didn't go through U.S. banks. Obviously, there are real concerns that many of us on this subcommittee share about looking for ways to provide access to the U.S. financial system that is not permitted, nor should it be permitted since it's not part of the Iran deal, or access to the dollar. So understanding that much of this falls under the purview of your colleagues at Treasury, can you tell us anything to help clarify some of these reports, help us understand what it is we've been reading?
Yes, thank you. Secretary Lew said to the Council on Foreign Relations, and let me repeat that and make it very clear, Iran will not have access to the American financial system. I think there was some confusion about this in the financial press. But let me say that we do want to carry out our commitments under the JCPOA, and companies have not done business in Iran for a long time, and they need to get comfortable with the prospects of this nuclear deal remaining in effect. So our colleagues in Treasury and other agencies are talking to businesses. They come to visit us in the State Department because our sanctions policy is very complex. So we try to explain how they can do business in Iran should they wish to do so. But let me say that while Iran so far has followed the letter of the agreement, they also need to send signals to the business community that they are not going to engage in provocative behavior. And when, as Mr. Wilson said, Iran is sending weapons to the Houthis in Iran, where they're helping out Hezbollah, when they're shooting off ballistic missiles, this raises concern in the business community about the safety and security of their investment. So Iran needs to understand what every financially successful country does, that you need to provide a safe and secure environment for businesses. So that's also at play here.
Just a couple follow-ups. The confusion in the financial press, has the administration, I understand what Secretary Lew has said, has there been at a lower level, has there been an engagement with that financial press to help clarify if there were mistakes made, to help them understand so that they could write about those as well?
I think so, Mr. Deutsch, because I frankly was in a meeting where this was discussed, and one leading financial newspaper, I think, was in the forefront of this, and I think there has been outreach to sort of clear up this issue. And
just before moving on, I would just point out, when we talk about Iran having lived up to its obligations under the nuclear deal, without engaging in a longer back and forth about this, the Security Council resolution, which does lay out the obligations of Iran under the nuclear deal, also includes the prohibition on ballistic missile tests. This is, and for those of us who had real concerns about their ability to continue to test ballistic missiles and to develop ballistic missile programs, the fact that there have now been multiple tests which clearly violate that Security Council resolution, I am appreciative of the administration's position of the sanctions that have been imposed, of the strong statements by Ambassador Power at the United Nations. I also, though, would take this moment to suggest that if the Security Council, despite our best efforts, will not take action in response to these violations of the Security Council resolutions, then the ballistic missile tests, which were not part of the nuclear deal, as you explained, there needs to be more done to penalize Iran. And if the international community won't do it, then the United States Congress, I think, has an obligation to do that, something that I know we're looking at and I think is important for us to move forward on. And just quickly on Syria, I don't have a lot of time. We're over 5 years now. The London Donor Conference took place February 4th. State Department announced over $925 million in additional assistance, with more than $600 million going to life-saving humanitarian assistance and over $300 million in development assistance, including $290 million for education in Jordan and Lebanon. And the budget request continues our tradition of robust humanitarian assistance. But Ambassador Patterson, given the unfulfilled pledges of past years, what do we do to work to ensure that the money that's pledged by others is actually received, that they actually live up to that commitment?
Could I first say about the ballistic missiles? First, we are pursuing this at the UN. We are imposing sanctions, and critically, I think, we are helping our Gulf partners increase their capacity to handle this ballistic missile problem, which is, they're, of course, the most vulnerable to Iran's ballistic missiles. And on the pledges on Syria, I think there has been considerable improvement in the compliance with the pledges, but it's certainly not perfect. And we are in a very constant dialogue with the other donors on this to encourage them. I'll get you the figures later in the afternoon.
And just one very quick question, Madam Chairman. I am sure this is a question that my staff and others on the committee could easily answer if I had asked them, but I didn't. Can you help those of us who, I mean, we're all so concerned about the situation in Syria and the slaughter of Syrian civilians by the Assad regime with the support of Hezbollah. And we talked, the number of people killed went up in reports from month to month as reviews were conducted. The last official report, the number was 200,000, 250,000. There are some who now suggest the number is closer to 500,000 people. I've heard 350,000. Is there, do we have a sense of what the number is? Because the fact that we're now well into the hundreds of thousands can't let us just accept that the number is so big that 200,000, 400,000, we know that Assad is terrible, we know that there's a slaughter, we know that the humanitarian impact has been so dire. It's important to recognize every one of the people, every one of his own citizens that Assad has butchered. Do we have a current number?
Mr. Deutsch, the number we use is somewhere between 250 and 300,000, which I appreciate lacks specificity. But it's hard to access some of these areas because, and for instance, mass graves exist. I don't think we really will know until this conflict is over. But let me also say that that's why it's so important this cessation of hostilities holds. Violence has dropped very significantly. There's still areas of very intense conflict, but throughout most of the country, violence is down. So the most important thing we can do now with Syria is try and maintain that ceasefire in place.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Excellent questions. Mr. DeSantis of Florida.
Ambassador Patterson, I just want to be clear. You said that Iran, under the proposed changes, would not have access to the U.S. financial system. Does that mean they would have no even indirect access to the U.S. dollar? In other words, would the dollar be allowed to use to facilitate transactions between Iran and other countries?
They can use the dollar offshore. I mean, they can access, if a bank in Malaysia holds dollars and trades with a bank in India, yes, they could use dollars.
Okay, so that represents a change from how those regulations have been interpreted in the past, correct?
I don't believe so, sir, but I'll have to check on that.
Because I think there was a lot of talk about whether the administration, when the Iran deal, they said no access to the financial system at all, and that was very clear. And now people are saying, well, it's not necessarily going to be access because the transactions may be dollarized, but no money is going to actually come in to the U.S. financial system. But as I understand it, there were members of the administration who said even dollarized transactions were not going to be something that was going to be permitted. And so am I wrong about that? Have we been getting mixed signals throughout these many months?
I don't know, sir. This is at an extraordinarily technical level, and I'll get somebody up here who knows this subject backward and forward to talk to you.
Okay. Well, we definitely want to hear that. In terms of, there's been a lot of great questions about money going to the Palestinian Authority, and I know under the appropriations as those are done annually, there's usually a requirement that the president asks for a waiver by certifying that there's a single Palestinian treasury and payroll, and that the Palestinian Authority is acting to counter incitement of violence against Israelis. Have those certifications been made in the last several years?
I don't know. I don't know, I don't know. Well, I'll find out.
Well, do you believe that that the Palestinian Authority is acting to counter incitement of violence against the Israelis?
This is, as you probably know, a subject of constant dialogue with us and the Palestinian Authority, and we have many discussions about this. On the issue of the single payroll, I was a little surprised at that, but we have many discussions with Minister Bashara, the Minister of Finance, of the Palestinian Authority. I honestly would not expect that to be a problem, but we'll look into this.
What, because there's, I think, really grave questions about these families of terrorists who are getting paid. A lot of them, they end up better off, their families are better off if they commit acts of terrorism against the Israelis than if they were to just work at a normal job inside areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And I listened to your back and forth with the chairwoman and with Chairman Royce, but I'm just not clear. What is the administration going to do something to address this problem? Because it seems like we have money going over there. They may say it's with other funds that they're paying it, but money's fungible, so we're effectively helping them do that. So what do we do? Are we deducting the amount that we give them based on how much money they're paying families of terrorists?
Well, no, sir, because we think that our program for the Palestinian Authority is absolutely necessary, all elements of it, and particularly the advances they've made in development of the police and the justice system and the humanitarian relief that's going both into Gaza and the West Bank. But as I say, we discuss this with them, we take it up with them. There are always, in all these assistance programs, conflicting priorities, but I would just stress how important this program is for overall stability in the region.
Well, I think that if they're actually facilitating payments to families of terrorists who are killing Israelis, then we should be deducting the amount of money at a minimum. I mean, I would go further than that, but I mean, at a minimum, we can't be complicit in that. Let me ask you, there's a bill that's working its way through the House of Representatives to have the State Department categorize the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization. Does the State Department have a position on that?
The State Department's position, your administration's position for many long years has been that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a terrorist organization, that they denounced violence many years ago. I can't remember the exact year, but they denounced violence many years ago. They are a legitimate political party in a number of countries in the Middle East.
So you don't believe that they're involved with international terrorism, the Brotherhood?
I'm sure that some elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as many other parties, are involved with terrorists, of course. There may be individual members who are involved, but as an organization, they denounced terrorism many years ago. I haven't seen the most recent version of the legislation, so I couldn't comment on that.
Well, I think that they're really a problem aspect of all this. And, President Sisi, he views the Brotherhood as a major threat to security in Egypt. And it seems to be, I mean, I guess, is it the administration's view still that the Brotherhood is largely a secular political organization and less an Islamist organization?
Of course, it's an Islamist organization. It is based on, it's the oldest of the Islamist organization, and of course it advocates, and did in Egypt and elsewhere, has a preference, of course, for Sharia law over what we would call typical civil law, so of course it's an Islamist organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that their views on they do support Sharia. They have a totalitarian ideology. Certainly the treatment of women is terrible. Treatment of religious minorities is terrible. And their tentacles really stretch. They are involved, I believe, financially in supporting violent Islamist groups. And I think that they're very much a cause for concern throughout the region. I'm out of time. I thank you guys for coming, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. DeSantis. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Patterson, the President's budget removes Egypt's partial aid conditions, the accompanying national security waiver, and the reporting requirement entirely. Would you describe the justification for proposing this removal of language? And do you think Egypt has made substantial progress on human rights that would warrant removal of these conditions? This is a pretty significant action.
Congressman, I think you will find that the administration in all these budget documents has removed most of those restrictions because, of course, the administration, as I mentioned in my oral statement, wants the maximum flexibility to implement its programs. So I wouldn't comment, but I will comment. Of course, Egypt's human rights situation is of great concern to us. There have certainly been reverses, significant reverses in the past few months. So yes, we're very concerned about that, but I wouldn't read the removal of that as a comment on the administration's view of Egypt's human rights.
Well, I guess my concern is is it read that way by the Egyptians? I mean, it may be that that's the policy of the department, but it just seems to me in the context of what we see happening in Egypt, it sends a very strange message at a time of increased human rights violations to remove these conditions. And so I would just raise that because I think it's very important that that not be the message. Would you also describe how the budget reflects resources being devoted to combat Iran's terrorist and destabilizing activities in the region? There's been a lot of conversation about the implementation of JCPOA and our expectation that we would be pushing back hard on Iran in a variety of other areas. I'd like it if you could speak to how the budget supports responding to Iran's activities in the region, and if there's any indication of a change in Iran's behavior, and as a result, particularly in the area of human rights, has there been an increase in the imposition of sanctions for human rights violations by Iran?
I think the budget supports countering Iran's influence in the region in several ways. One is to strengthen Iraq, and you notice a very substantial increase in our budget for Iraq. So there's certainly Iranian influence in Iraq that we need to counter, malign influence. In Yemen, we've asked for a substantial amount. We also have a good pipeline with Yemen, but it is very important to get the Iranians out of Yemen, and to do that, we have to have a peace process and then strengthen the government so it can counter Iranian influence. I might also add that we are very active with our GCC partners in strengthening their capacity through maritime, through cyber security, through ballistic missile defense, through improved special forces activities. They pay for most of this themselves. It isn't reflected in the budget, but we are engaged in a very active dialogue. The President's going to Riyadh next week to talk to them in more detail about this. And then finally, sir, our Navy and Armed Forces are very active in this, and there have been for instance, 4 interdictions of Iranian weapons going to Yemen in the past few weeks. So this is a very high priority for our military colleagues operating in the Gulf.
My last 2 questions, Ambassador, are what is the status of the MOU negotiations with Israel? Are there some additional options being considered in light of new threats to their security? And finally, does the budget reflect any rebuilding in Syria, or is it really still focused on responding to the immediate crisis? And how are we supporting this work to ensure that the ceasefire holds? And does the budget provide some resources to do that, and in what way?
On the MOU with Israel, there have been a number of meetings, very, very intense and long meetings with the Israelis about this, and they were extremely useful in giving us a good picture of Israel's security needs. As the chairman said, they're certainly more acute over the next few years. So we've had a lot of intensive discussions. I honestly don't know if we're going to finish this before the end of the administration because it's hard. And there are a lot of issues underway, and let me also stress, Madam Chairman, that protection of QME is a centerpiece of this. There is no doubt that that's going to be rigorously observed. So I don't know if we're finished. There are lots of financial implications. There are implications on sourcing of materials, but we're working hard on this. It's a very high priority for the administration. And you asked her about Syria. We have asked for additional resources for Syria. Some of it will go into rebuilding. We have a fund, I think largely, we have a multinational donor fund for rebuilding. It has about $100 million in it. That's probably going to be a drop in the bucket. But our efforts through Turkey to support the moderate opposition, for instance, we've managed to keep 30,000 civil servants and teachers and policemen employed through all this. We've given grants to local councils. We managed in some places to keep health clinics open, even in places that were overrun by ISIL. So we have asked for an increase in Syria, and we hope that these mechanisms will provide at least some kind of baseline for rebuilding Syria.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. And now we turn to Mr. Issa.
Thank you. Administrator, I'll start with you. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the number is staggering, but let's just look at Lebanon with 500 to 800,000. And in this particular case, unlike the usual numbers in the Middle East, I think the number is probably accurate at 800,000 school-age children who are beyond Lebanon's ordinary capability to educate. I'm going to pose a minute question. My understanding is the minister who's here in the U.S. right now of Education has issued a number of MOUs. As a matter of fact, it appears as though anyone that comes in saying they'd like to educate these Syrians with Lebanese standards is getting an MOU, and then my understanding is they come to you for money. Is that a fair statement, that you're getting a lot of people with proposals of how to do it if you'll just provide the dollars?
We've worked very closely with Minister Bousab, and we are meeting with him again this week, and my colleague signed an MOU with him last week. But that's
the 42.
That's the $41 million for the basic education program, and this program is going to address needs for first through fourth graders to give them access to basic education and early grade reading. This is going to affect over 100,000 or over 10,000 children, and this is
but it's conventional education expansion.
It's conventional education, but at the same time, as you had asked in your opening statement as well, we are talking to the minister about verification or certification of being able to take students who have been out of school and get them back into formal education through non-formal education programs. And this is a very important part because, as I stated, there are 13 million children out of school because of this crisis, and those that are in Lebanon and Jordan are both suffering, and without non-formal education, you can't have a student who left school as a 9-year-old go back to school as a 15-year-old. They need something in between, and they need to get back into this system.
So how do we leverage e-learning and other abilities to provide, if you will, free, notwithstanding the delivery device, free education to people on both sides of the conflict area? I mentioned the radio one because I became aware of it. It's novel, but it's pretty much old school. And you know, most people in the Middle East that learn English learn it by American songs. Many people that learn Arabic learn it by Arab songs. But that isn't necessarily any more productive to real education than memorizing the Quran is to producing moderates. So what is, briefly, and you're welcome to follow up with me beyond this hearing, what is it we can do to sort of leapfrog the incremental dollars where 41 million is proposed to provide you 100,000, and those are probably the easiest 100,000 because they don't include the expansion of schools and conventional brick and mortar, which could easily be in the many billions for what we hope is a shorter period of time, and it wouldn't address the people on the other side of the conflict line.
Thank you. I would be happy to follow up with you. We're actually in the process right now of a co-creation with a number of organizations that do non-formal education and informal education to look at what some of the best practices are worldwide in trying to bring education to populations like this, and we'd be happy to follow up with you.
Okay. I'm going to not make a suggestion that is anything more than just a thought that I've had listening to many of the groups. In the day of the Internet, it would seem that today the entire curriculum necessary to provide a baccalaureate, including teaching, should be online, hosted somewhere in the world, probably by us in the cloud, for Arab speakers, at least in the Levant language designation area, to get their degrees. It would seem like that is a question of producing the content. Now, then getting that delivered is a complex question of bandwidth, servers, iPads, whatever the delivery system is. But it would seem that until USAID finds who's going to produce, if you will, a complete content that would lead to a baccalaureate and get the Lebanese and other Arab countries to buy into the idea that this is moderate, educational, and doable, we don't yet then have the distribution. And I appreciate you're keeping teachers working, but I don't think we can produce enough teachers ever and paper to deal with this in a way that's going to address the young man or woman who's working 14 hours a day and only got a 4th grade education and will never get more education until we come up with an alternate delivery plan. Madam Chair, since I appear to be the last, would you mind if I go a little longer? Thank you. Ambassador, I'm going to switch to you. I mentioned the multinational force, and I think I was fairly bold in echoing, to be honest, the Washington Post and others who have recognized that we have a substantial investment there of people who are daily often being shelled, who are in harm's way for a mission that is now, from your own experience in Egypt, is now, by anyone's reasonable expectations, no longer the mission they were placed there for in the late 1970s. What would you say, recognizing that you can't speak for the whole administration, to that basic concept that their obligation is to peace in the region and not necessarily to counting heads at borders?
Mr. Issa, we are, as you probably know, concerned about some of the same issues that you have raised, particularly about the safety of American and other
and our allied
allies,
partners,
the Colombians, the Fijians, the others that work with us there,
the Czech,
have bravely for many years. So we are discussing a reconfiguration plan that would reduce the risk to our personnel and still maintain the necessary monitoring through better technology and other instruments that have evolved over the past few decades. I think the Israelis and the Egyptians may not quite see it that way, that the mandate is outmoded, and there were, in fact, when I was there, there were some events that required sort of the traditional role of MFO to take care of. But I thought your idea was an interesting one. I think it's contrary to sort of the mandate of MFO that it would stay there as a peacekeeper. But I think it's an interesting idea. Let me say that.
Okay, well, in closing, I love interesting ideas. When Congressman Farenthold and I went there now more than a year ago and looked at where rounds had landed, met with the explosive ordnance disposal team, looked at the threat, recognized the active engagement by the Egyptians, with active both in the air and ground of the newly formed, if you will, or new partnership of ISIS and the Sinai, it became obvious that we were currently not participating, and yet we were there, and we were obviously being attacked by ISIS. So I guess as we look at the interesting idea, I would only ask that if not something similar to the direction that I was suggesting that Secretary Kerry and the administration might be able to convince, and I'm happy to go there. I'm fortunately very well received on both sides of the Sinai, for the fact that we can do more if we have a will to do it and if they're willing to let us do it. But if we do just what we're doing, we are, in fact, sitting there inevitably waiting to lose brave peacekeepers for something which, quite frankly, is unlikely to happen. As you know, the Egyptians are not likely to mount an offensive across the border, and the Israelis are not in particular peril that that would occur. That doesn't change the fact that they don't want us to leave, but I do think they want us to do more if we can, and do it in cooperation with both countries. So I leave that with you because I have no greater message from that trip than the status quo would seem to be less than we should do.
Mr. Issa, let me say we entirely agree with you about the status quo. This is frankly unsustainable, and since you were there a year ago, the security situation has deteriorated. So a mandate that needs modernization, I think is fair to say, and a force configuration that needs reassessment to minimize risk, if nothing else. And as you know, security cooperation between the Israelis and the Egyptians, particularly in the Sinai, has never been better.
Yeah, we got to witness that, and Madam Chair, that was the good part of that visit, is that the relationship between the current government of Egypt and the current government of Israel is one with common enemies of both the ISIS in the Sinai and, of course, Hamas, both of which are known terrorist organizations. I would close by saying I am equally concerned that the Muslim Brotherhood is a political organization with a strong bent against the type of freedom that America stands for. And if we cannot determine them to be a terrorist organization in this body, we certainly have to recognize that they showed their true colors during their short time heading Egyptian government. And to the Coptic community and others that people on the dais talked about, I think it goes without saying that America must take a stand against the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood, both as a political organization and as what I believe to be a terrorist wing. And so, Madam Chair, thank you so much for the indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. They are a terrorist group. It's the emperor has no clothes, but if we don't want to see it, it doesn't mean that he's nonetheless naked. And I wanted to ask just one question. Even though Mr. Deutsch is not here, he's allowed me to do this, so I'm not speaking out of school. All of us in our subcommittee, we're very interested in keeping the Iraqi Jewish archives operating here in the United States because many people want to see these historical artifacts, and it would find a good home here. We understand that perhaps they will be eventually go back to Iraq, but have any of the 3,500 items, do you know if they've been returned to Iraq, and if so, how many? If you could let us know. And have we been able to secure the Iraqi Jewish archives going to other museums, other exhibition sites? I had talked to Brett McGurk, and he assured me that State was working with NARA to identify venues where the archives could go. And we are willing to work with the State Department to see how we can be of help to making sure that these very important artifacts of the Iraqi Jewish archives stay safe and a place where people can see them. And they were there in my district in Miami Beach, the FIU Jewish Museum, and what a great turnout. So people are interested, they want to see them, and this is a great place for them here in the United States where people can admire them. Maybe in Iraq they're not as appreciated, but we're willing to have it go back, but once they do the whole tour, I want to be a roadie for that
Thank
tour.
you, Madam Chair. I'll get back to you on that. I think that's right. They were on a trip around the United States to suitable museums, and at some point they would go back to Iraq under proper security and appreciation for their historic value. But let me get back to you on exactly where they are now.
Thank you very much. And with that, our subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you, ladies, again for always being accessible.